This is a story from Brittany. Now, there was once a king who had a lovely daughter whose name was Tryphene. And that king adored this daughter, and he would have given up all of his lands and castle rather than see her unhappy for a moment. But word came to the king that their evil neighbor, Count Camor, had seen Tryphene at the market, and he wished to marry her. Oh, no, no, said the king. She's too young. And the count's emissaries, who had come bearing honey and linen and beer, said he will not take no for an answer, and he will be massing his troops on your borders. Now, Count Camor was known to be a violent and evil man. Even as a child, when he left the castle, his mother would ring a bell to let the townspeople know that he was abroad. He had already had 4 wives, and it was rumored he had done them in. But the king was not a cowardly man, and he began to get his knights and his own army ready, though it was no match for Count Camor's. And Tryphene was wringing her hands in her room when the holy man Gildas came to her. He had sailed across the sea using his cape as a sail, and he said, "Only you can stop the bloodshed of the young men of Vaz," which was the region they lived in. And she said, "Oh, were that I a beggar maid and I could choose my own husband. If I must marry him, say the prayers for the dead for me, for surely I will follow the other wives." "Do not worry," said Gildas. I will give you this silver ring, and it is white as milk, but should it turn black, you will know that Camor is plotting against you." With this small reassurance, Tryphene agreed to marry Count Camor, and it was a grand wedding. There were barrels of wine and beer, there were roasts, there was a great cake. It went on for a week. And when the festivities were done, Camor went back to his own castle like a hawk with a dove in its claws. But things were good for a time, for he seemed to genuinely love the young woman, and the townspeople were mildly optimistic that their liege had changed and was no longer so bloodthirsty. But his wicked retainers knew it wouldn't last. Tryphene was not happy there. She missed her family. The palace was cold, and she would often go down, deep, deep down below the palace to the crypt, where the graves of the 4 previous wives were, and she would light a candle for them. And when she was down there, she seemed to hear whispers in the air. "Oh, poor Tryphene, poor Tryphene." Now came a time when the king of the country insisted that all his lords come and pay homage to him. And they would go and they would meet, and they would be there for months. And Count Camor reluctantly said goodbye to his new bride, and he left. And it was a long time before he came back. But he was eager to see Tryphene. He was rushed back, but when he came in, she was embroidering a satin baby bonnet. And he said, "What child is this for?" And she said, "It is for our child, Count. Soon we will have a child of our own." And his face, instead of taking on the joy of a new father, he went black with rage and stormed out. And when Tryphene looked down at her hand, the ring had turned black. "Oh," she said, where can I go?" And she ran out of her chambers, and she ran down, 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 down into the crypts below. And louder than ever she heard, "Oh, poor Tryphene, poor Tryphene." And the shades arose from their crypts, and they said, "Beware, beware, Camor is on the lookout to kill you." "But what have I done?" said Tryphene. And another one said, "You bear his child. It is foretold that the child will be the death of him. What can I do? You must flee and go back to your father." "Oh," said Tryphene, but he has let out the dogs already." And one of the shades stepped forward with a face that was green and mottled, and she held out a cake to Tryphene with a little bite taken out of it. "Here, give them the poison he gave me." "Oh, but how will I get over the walls?" And a second shade came forward, her neck curiously twisted, and she handed Tryphene a rope and said, "Here, use the rope he hung me with." "Oh, but but the woods are dark. And the third shade stepped forward, her countenance black and burnt, and said, "Take this torch. It will flare to light as it did when I was burned on the pyre." "Oh," said Tryphene, "but I am heavy with child. How will I walk so far?" And the last shade stepped forward, a great cleft in the top of her head, and she held out a staff, and she said, "Take this staff that he cleft my head with." And Tryphene did as they suggested. She threw the cake to the dogs, and they dropped down dead. And she went to the wall and tossed the rope, and it seemed to fly up on its own, and she was able to get over the wall. And there in the darkness on the other side, she held up the torch, and it glowed and lit her way. And with the staff, she was able to make good time all that night to get away from her husband. She had walked and she walked, and dawn was coming, and she thought she must rest somewhere. So she found the little shepherd's hut, and she curled up in there, shivering from the cool and the cold air. Oh, and she said to herself, "Poor Tryphene, poor Tryphene." And a little mockingbird heard it and took up the call, "Poor Tryphene, poor Tryphene." Now Count Camor had gone to the top tower when he could not find his wife anywhere. And he had looked to the north, and he saw a crow croaking. And he looked to the east, and there was a seagull. And he looked to the west, and there was a morning swallow. But to the east, there was a white dove flying, and he said, "That is Tryphene." And he mounted his horse, and he got his hunting dogs, and he made chase. Now Tryphene began to walk again, and she looked at her ring. It was black, and she knew that Camor must be on her trail, and she walked as fast as she could, but that fast walking brought on labor, and she had to lay down in a patch of moss and give birth to a boy all by herself. And while she was recovering, a hawk flew down, and she recognized the jesses on the hawk's foot as her father's colors. And she took off the ring and she gave it to the hawk, and she said, "Take this to my father and let him know that I am in dire need." And the hawk flew off. Now it was a pity she had given him the ring, because now she could not tell, except by the sound of the dogs baying, that Count Camor was close. She hid the baby in a hollow tree, and she stood up to meet her husband. He spoke not a word. He drew his sword and took her head. And then he gave a great sigh of relief, mounted his horse, and headed back to his castle. But the hawk did find Tryphene's father. He flew into the window of the hall, and he dropped the ring into the king's cup. And when the king saw the black ring, he knew that his daughter would be in grave difficulty, and he said, "We must go and find her, and Gildas, you must come, for this is part your doing." And they all mounted horses, and with the hawk flying before them, they came upon Tryphene, her head separated from her body. And her father began to weep, and his knights wept, but Gildas said, "No, no, on your knees." And he went to the body, and he commanded her to stand upright. And he picked up the head, and he put it back on her shoulders, and she breathed again. And then she went and she found the baby and cradled it in her arms. And the holy man Gildas said, "We must put an end to this evil. Come." And they all went back to the castle of Count Camor. Now when Count Camor saw his wife walking, holding the baby, he had the drawbridge drawn up, and he and his evil retainers were all looking down from the battlements. The holy man Gildas took the baby and stood him up, a miracle that he could stand. And he said to the child, "Give your father justice." And the newborn baby reached down, and he took up a handful of sand, and he threw it at the castle, and every grain of sand became a great boulder, and it knocked the castle down and down and down, taking Camor and his evil retainers with it. And when Tryphene looked back, she saw the shades of the 4 wives flying up to heaven. And then she went back to her father's palace with her baby, and they thought no more about Count Camor. And in fact, this is the story of Saint Tryphene, who is often pictured with the baby in one arm and the head in the other. And she is the patron saint of difficult childbirth. Thank you.